Hi, today's story is At my wedding, my mother in law said, I must serve her family. I asked two questions, 129 missed calls. Hope you enjoy this story. Before we begin dinner, I am a mother who only wants to say a few words about my son's new life. The microphone screeched a sharp metallic sound that sliced through the soft jazz playing in the Riverside event hall. I froze. My hand, which had been reaching for a crystal glass of champagne, stopped inches from the ivory tablecloth. Connie Barton didn't ask the band for the mic. She didn't signal the coordinator. She simply took it. Lei is a very independent woman. She spat the word independent like it was a stain on a white rug. The jazz music died. The clinking of silverware against china stopped. 120 guests, people I had carefully invited and sat at these tables, went silent. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I could smell her perfume, that heavy, powdery scent of white shoulders drifting toward me from the stage. And in our family, independence is just another word for not knowing your place yet. But don't worry. We have plans. Lei will be moving to Westerville, right next door to us. She will be handling the logistics of Derek's household so he can finally focus on his true potential at the firm. Family comes first. Always. This isn't a request, dear. This is just how we do things. The satin of my wedding dress felt like a cage pressing hard against my ribs as I tried to breathe. My name is Lei Donovan. I am 36 years old. I am a structural engineer who calculates load-bearing weights for skyscrapers. I know when a foundation is about to crack, and right now I was watching the man I just married stare at his own fingernails. Derek didn't look up. He didn't grab the mic. He didn't even flinch. He sat there, his warm hand still resting on the small of my back, while his mother told a room full of my colleagues and friends that I was being retired into a support role for his life. I looked at the centerpiece on our table, a cluster of white roses. Lei, you're making a scene, a voice in the back of my head whispered. It was my mother's voice. The same voice that told me when I was 12 years old to make myself useful if I wanted to stay in the room. I'd spent 20 years making myself useful. I'd spent 18 months paying 80% of the bills for our shared life while Derek found his footing. Connie was smiling at the crowd. She looked like a queen regent granting a pardon. I pulled away from Derek's touch. The movement was small, but it felt like tearing a ligament. I reached for my champagne glass and set it down. It made a tiny clink against the table, but in that dead air it sounded like a gunshot. Mrs. Barton, I said. My voice was level. It was the voice I used when a contractor tried to tell me that a 3/4-inch bolt would hold a 10-ton beam. I have two questions. Connie's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed. Of course, daughter. I didn't look at her. I turned my head slowly toward the man sitting next to me, the man wearing the tuxedo I had paid for. Derek, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying to the back of the room. Did you know she was going to say this? The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 7. I counted the beats of my own heart against the lace of my bodice. Derek finally looked at me. His eyes weren't shocked. They weren't angry. They were tired. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. And I continued. My throat felt like it was lined with glass. Do you agree with her? He didn't say no. He didn't defend me. He looked from me to his mother, then back down at the table. Lei, let's just eat, he muttered. We can talk about this later. Later is for people who don't have all the facts, Derek. I have all the facts now. I stood up. I didn't rush. I smoothed the skirts of my dress. 120 people were holding their breath. I could see my maid of honor, Paige, standing 3 feet behind me. Her knuckles were white around her bouquet. I reached up and felt the weight of the diamond on my left hand. It was beautiful. It was expensive. And it was a lie. I twisted the band. It was tied sticking to my skin in the heat of the room, but I pulled until it slid over my knuckle. I didn't throw it. I didn't scream. I placed the ring on the table right next to the half-eaten wedge of brie on Derek's plate. I'm going to my car now, I said to the table at large. I walked toward the exit. The sound of my heels on the hardwood floor was rhythmic and steady. Behind me, I heard Connie start to speak again, her voice high and fluttering with fake concern, but I didn't stop. I pushed through the heavy oak doors of the Riverside Event Hall and stepped into the October night. The Ohio air was sharp and smelled of damp earth and gasoline. The parking lot was mostly empty, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the overhead security lights. My car was parked at the very edge of the lot, a habit from years of wanting an easy exit from every site I visited. Paige was suddenly there walking beside me. She didn't say a word. She just matched my stride, her heels clicking on the asphalt. I reached my car and leaned against the cold metal of the door. My hands weren't shaking. That was the most terrifying part. I felt a strange hollowed-out clarity, like a building that had been gutted by fire but was still standing. Leigh Page whispered. "What do you need?" I pulled my phone from my small clutch. It was 6:51 p.m. I tapped the icon for the voice memo app and hit record. I didn't know why yet. Maybe it was the engineer in me, the part that needed to document the failure of the structure. "I need to call Gail Foster," I said. "Your lawyer?" Paige asked. "My lawyer?" The phone rang twice before Gail picked up. She didn't say hello. She knew the schedule. She knew I was supposed to be cutting a cake right now, Leigh. "Is it done, Gail?" "The deed to the house on Miller Avenue." "It's in my name only, correct?" There was a pause on the other end. I could hear the rustle of papers. "Yes. I handled the filing myself last June." "Only your name." "Why? Because I need to change the locks tonight. And I need to know if I have the legal right to bar him from entry." Gail's voice dropped an octave, becoming professional and sharp. "You have the right. It is your separate property." "Leigh, tell me what happened." "I just put my ring on a dinner plate in front of 120 people." Gail was silent for 3 seconds. "Go home. Do not let anyone in. I will call a locksmith I trust to meet you there in 40 minutes. And Leigh, do not answer your phone if his mother calls." I looked back toward the venue. The doors opened and a silhouette appeared. It was Connie. She was standing under the portico, shading her eyes against the parking lot lights, looking for me. I climbed into the driver's seat. Paige got into the passenger side, still clutching her bouquet of lilies. I turned the key. The engine roared to life, a low, comforting vibration under my feet. As I pulled out of the parking lot, my phone lit up on the dashboard. Incoming call, Connie Barton. 7:09 p.m. I didn't answer. I drove. I didn't look in the rearview mirror, but I knew Derek was standing in that doorway, now realizing for the first time that his mother's plan had one fatal flaw. She thought I needed a family. She didn't realize I already had a home and his name wasn't on the door. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled away from the Riverside Event Hall, leaving the lights of my own wedding reception behind me. In the passenger seat, Paige was a statue, her silk bridesmaid dress rustling every time I hit a pothole. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. The air inside the car was thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp metallic tang of my own adrenaline. My phone sat in the cup holder, a small rectangular ghost that kept flickering to life. "Connie. Connie. Derek. Connie." The names pulsed against the plastic, but I didn't look. I kept my eyes on the road, watching the white lines disappear under my headlights like the last 3 years of my life. Back at the venue, I knew exactly what was happening. The jazz band would have stopped playing. The 120 guests would be huddled in small groups, their voices a low, frantic hum of gossip. Derek would be standing in the center of that room, looking at the empty chair where his bride should be sitting. I could almost see him, his hands stuffed into his tuxedo pockets, waiting for his mother to tell him what to do next. Connie would be in full control, her voice rising in fake performative grief, telling everyone that I was just overwhelmed, that I was always so sensitive. She would try to turn my exit into a clinical symptom of a breakdown. But she couldn't erase the image of that ring sitting on the dinner plate. The drive to my house in Columbus took 24 minutes. I watched the city skyline blur past the office buildings, where I spent my days calculating the structural integrity of steel and concrete. I understood foundations. I understood that if a single bolt was sheared, the entire beam was compromised. I had been ignoring the shear bolts in my relationship for 18 months, convincing myself that the structure could still hold the weight. Tonight, the weight had become too much. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked different. It was a craftsman style, with a white front porch and a blue door I had painted myself. I bought this place 2 years before I met Derek. I paid the mortgage from an account he never saw. As I killed the engine, the silence was deafening. Paige finally moved her hand, reaching out to touch my shoulder. Her skin was warm, a sharp contrast to the cold void opening up in my chest. "You did the right thing, Lee," she whispered. I didn't answer. I just gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The headlights of a taxi swept across my front door 40 minutes later. I was standing in the kitchen, the lights turned low, watching through the blinds. Derek climbed out. He looked smaller than he had 2 hours ago. He walked up the path, his steps heavy, and reached for the doorknob. I heard the faint jiggle of metal against metal. He tried again. Then he knocked. It wasn't a loud knock. It was the sound of someone who expected the door to open because it always had. I walked to the door but didn't unlock it. I kept the heavy brass chain in place and cracked it just an inch. The cold night air rushed in, smelling of wood smoke and the exhaust from the departing taxi. Derek stood there, his bow tie undone and hanging around his neck like a noose. "Lay open the door," he said. His voice was ragged. "This is ridiculous." My mother was just trying to help. She didn't mean anything by it. I looked at him through the gap. In the yellow glow of the porch light, I saw the man I thought I was going to grow old with. But I also saw the nod, that small instinctive movement he made when his mother claimed my life as her own. "How long have you known she was going to do that, Derek?" I asked. My voice didn't sound like mine. It was hollow, stripped of all the warmth I used to have for him. He looked down at his shoes. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the wind rattling the dry leaves in the gutters. 3 days, he whispered. She told me 3 days ago. She said it would be a surprise. She said it was the best way to make sure we started off on the right foot. "The right foot," I repeated. "You mean her foot on my neck?" I stepped back, my hand on the edge of the door. "You need to find somewhere else to stay tonight, Derek. I suggest your mother's house." "Lay, you can't be serious," he said, his voice rising. "This is my home too. It's my house, Derek. It has always been my house. You were just a guest who forgot to leave." I closed the door. The sound of the latch clicking home was final. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood, listening to him call my name from the porch. He stayed there for 10 minutes, his muffled voice begging me to be reasonable. Then the heavy thud of the locksmith's van pulling into the driveway drowned him out. The locksmith was a man named Miller, a silver-haired professional who didn't ask questions about why a woman in a wedding dress was standing in her kitchen while a man in a tuxedo stood on her lawn. He worked quickly, the sound of his drill, a high whining scream that felt like it was happening inside my own skull. Paige stood at the counter, brewing a pot of chamomile tea. The scent of the herbs drifted through the house, a small domestic comfort in the middle of the wreckage. Gail Foster called me via video just as Miller was handing me the 2 new keys. "Only 2, Lay?" he asked. "Just 2, I told him. 1 for me and 1 for the woman standing next to me. On the screen of my laptop, Gail looked like she was sitting in her office. She was still wearing a blazer, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Play it for me," she said. I didn't have to ask what she meant. I picked up my phone and played the audio file I had recorded in the parking lot. Connie's voice filled the kitchen, clear and sharp. "Lee will handle the logistics. This isn't a request. Family comes first." Gail leaned back, her eyes narrowing behind her glasses. "Ohio is a one-party consent state, Lee. You recorded it, it's legal. And it is a gold mine." She looked at me, her expression softening for just a second. "You were smart to check the deed last year. You were smart to keep your accounts separate. Most women in your position would be standing in the street right now with nothing but a suitcase." I sat down at the kitchen table, the satin of my dress bunching up around my hips. "I don't feel smart, Gail. I feel like I've been living in a house with a rotting foundation for 3 years, and I'm just now smelling the mold." Gail nodded slowly. "The first step to fixing a structure is seeing the damage for what it is. You did that tonight. Now we move to the next phase. He's going to come back, Lay. And his mother is going to come with him. They think they can wear you down. They think you need them." I looked at the 2 new keys sitting on the granite countertop. They were silver and shiny, untouched by the hands of the man who had been sleeping in my bed for 3 years. I thought I needed him, I said, looking at Paige. I thought being part of their family made me more than just a woman who works 60 hours a week and eats dinner alone. Paige sat down across from me, pushing a steaming mug of tea toward my hand. You were always more than that, she said. They were just the ones who made you feel small so they could feel big. Gail's voice came through the speakers again. There's something else, Lay. Something I found when I was looking through the records tonight. You need to see the third page of the file I sent you. Not tonight, though. Get some sleep. Tomorrow is Saturday, and the real battle hasn't even started yet. I thanked her and closed the laptop. The kitchen was quiet again. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the notifications. 129 missed calls. Connie Barton had called 11 times. Derek had called 4. The rest were from aunts, cousins, and friends of the family I barely knew. I hit the button to mute all notifications and set the phone face down. I stayed in the kitchen with Paige for a long time, the tea growing cold in our mugs. Outside, the wind picked up, shaking the branches of the maple tree against the siding of the house. It was a familiar sound, one I had heard 1,000 times, but tonight it felt like a warning. As I walked toward my bedroom, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. I looked like a ghost in all that white lace. I reached back and started undoing the tiny pearl buttons one by one until the dress pulled at my feet like a sheepskin. I left it there on the floor. I climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling. The silence of the house was different now. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. I thought about the third page Gail mentioned and the way Connie had looked at the crowd while she was dismantling my life. Somewhere across town, Derek was probably sitting on his mother's floral sofa, listening to her tell him that everything would be fine, that I would come around. He didn't know that I had already changed the locks. He didn't know that the man who had walked out of that venue was never coming back inside this house. My last thought before sleep finally pulled me under was about the apartment Derek used to have, the one he told me he had sublet when he moved in with me. I wondered if the subtenant was still there, or if, like everything else Connie Barton touched, that apartment was just another part of the blueprint I hadn't been allowed to see. I woke up at 6:30 on Saturday morning without the help of an alarm. My internal clock was a precision instrument calibrated by years of checking structural blueprints before the sun hit the construction sites. For a few seconds, the ceiling of my bedroom was just a white expanse of plaster. Then the weight of the previous night settled back onto my chest. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. The screen was a wall of notifications. 129 missed calls. I scrolled through them, counting the digital ghosts of my failed wedding. 29 from Connie, 18 from Derek, 12 from unknown numbers that I suspected belonged to the Barton cousins. I sat there in the silence, watching the blue light of the screen dim, and didn't feel a single thing except a cold, hollow sort of curiosity. I slipped out of bed and walked into the kitchen. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. It felt reclaimed. The automatic coffee maker had already finished its cycle, and the scent of dark roast filled the room. I had programmed that timer a year ago, back when I thought I was making coffee for 2. I never bothered to change it. Paige was still asleep on the sofa, her mouth slightly open, still clutching the empty wine glass she had brought home from the venue. I grabbed a throw blanket from the armchair and draped it over her shoulders. She didn't stir. I took my mug to the window and watched the Ohio morning light filter through the maple trees. It was a beautiful day, the kind of day people chose for autumn weddings. The irony didn't escape me, but it didn't hurt either. I was too busy calculating the next move. When you find a crack in a load-bearing wall, you don't stand around crying about the wallpaper. You brace the structure. The doorbell rang at 8:17. It wasn't a tentative ring. It was the sound of someone who believed they had a right to be heard. I peered through the sidelight. Connie was standing on the porch, wearing a perfectly tailored beige trench coat that made her look like a diplomat. Derek stood behind her, his shoulders hunched, looking at the floorboards. Beside them was a woman I recognized from the rehearsal dinner, Derek's aunt Brenda Knox. She was 55 and had the kind of pinched expression that suggested she had spent her life sucking on lemons. I opened the door, but I didn't remove the security chain. The 2-inch gap was enough. Connie immediately stepped forward, her face melting into a mask of maternal concern. "Lay, honey," she said. Her voice was like honey poured over gravel. "We need to talk like adults. I know you're upset, but you can't just shut everyone out. I only want what's best for you, dear. You can't do this to Derek. You're making such a scene out of a small misunderstanding. I didn't answer her tactics. I didn't defend myself. I just looked past her at Derek, who still wouldn't meet my eyes. Where were you last night, Derek?" I asked. My voice was flat, echoing the clinical tone I use for site inspections. Connie froze. Her practiced smile wavered for a fraction of a second. Derek looked up, his face pale in the morning light. "Lay, I just needed some space," he began. "Where were you, Derek?" I repeated. "Did you go back to your apartment, or did you go to your mother's?" Connie stepped in, her voice hardening. "He was with family, Lay, where he belongs. Now be a sensible girl and unlatch this door so we can sit down." And I looked Connie straight in the eye. I could smell her white shoulders perfumed through the crack in the door, a heavy, suffocating scent. "The apartment, Connie. The one on High Street. Is Derek's name still on the lease? Or is that what you meant by moving to Westerville?" The silence that followed was the most honest thing that had happened between us in 3 years. Connie didn't blink. She didn't deny it. She just stared at me with a cold, calculating intensity. Behind her, Brenda Knox huffed and crossed her arms. "This is exactly what I was talking about," Connie Brenda muttered. "No respect for family values." "Thank you for stopping by," I said. I closed the door and slid the deadbolt home. I heard Brenda gasp and Connie start to pound on the wood, but I didn't stay to listen. I walked back into the kitchen, where Paige was now sitting up, rubbing her eyes and looking at the door. "Was that them?" Paige asked. "That was the welcoming committee," I said. I picked up my car keys. "Get dressed. We're going to Gail's office." Gail Foster's office was in a converted brick building downtown, filled with the smell of old paper and expensive espresso. She didn't have a receptionist on Saturdays, so she met us at the door herself. She looked like she hadn't slept, but her eyes were sharp behind her reading glasses. She led us into her private office and laid 3 pieces of paper out on the mahogany desk. The first was the deed to my house confirming my sole ownership. The second was a legal memo stating that since the ceremony was never completed and no license was signed, no legal marriage existed. Then she pushed the third paper toward me. It was a printout of a text message thread. I reached for it, but Gail put her hand over it for a moment. "I need to know if you're ready for this, Lay," she said. "I pull these records for a living, and even I found this distasteful. This didn't start last night." I took the paper. My hands were steady as I looked at the first message dated 3 months ago. I didn't read it out loud. I didn't have to. The words burned into my retina. Connie Barton's name was at the top of every bubble. I looked at Gail. "Where did you get this?" I asked. Gail glanced at Paige, then back at me. "A source that prefers to remain anonymous for now," she said. "But the authenticity is verified. You need to read it, Lay. Not today, perhaps, if you aren't ready. But soon. Because they aren't going to stop with a visit to your front porch." I stared at the third page, the one Gail had mentioned. The text was small and dense. I could feel Paige leaning in beside me, her breath hitching, as she caught a glimpse of the words. I didn't open it yet. I folded the paper and tucked it into my bag. I had spent my life building things that were meant to last, things that could withstand wind and rain and time. I had thought my relationship was one of those things. Now I realized I had been building on a sinkhole, and the woman who dug it was currently standing on my porch. I walked out of the office and into the bright Saturday sun. The city was moving, people were shopping, life was continuing, as if my world hadn't ended at a dinner table. I looked at my phone. 67 missed calls now. I wasn't just collecting data anymore. I was preparing for a demolition. I reached into my bag and felt the crisp edge of that third paper. I knew that once I read it, there would be no going back. There would be no room for forgiveness or misunderstandings. I looked at the pedestrians crossing the street and felt a strange cold peace. "I'm ready," I whispered to the wind. The family group chat had been a low hum in the background of my life for 6 months, a digital swarm of Barton cousins, aunts, and siblings that I usually ignored. On Saturday afternoon, the notifications began to arrive in waves. I was lying on my sofa with a damp cloth over my eyes, trying to block out the sharp Columbus sun. Paige sat in the armchair across from me, her phone in her hand, scrolling through the thread with a grimace. She started reading the messages out loud, her voice dripping with a dry, dark humor that was the only thing keeping me from shattering. "Listen to this one from Aunt Brenda," Paige said, tossing a popcorn kernel into her mouth. "She says I always knew Lay was a bit cold, but to walk out on a wedding dinner, it's simply unchristian. Someone needs to tell her that an apology is the only way she'll ever find peace." Then, Derek's cousin Mark chimed in, asking if anyone knows a cheap lawyer, because apparently the Bartons are worried about the security deposit on the venue. And here is the best one. A direct quote from Derek's mom. "I'm at the Marriott and my credit card just got declined. I don't have enough for another night." I kept my eyes closed, listening to the hollow echo of their entitlement. They weren't mourning a relationship, they were mourning a bank account. I reached out my fingers, fumbling for my phone on the coffee table. My thumb hovered over the screen for a second, then I tapped the Leave Group button. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't defend my honor. I just deleted the thread and felt the digital weight lift off my shoulders. It was a small step, a tiny snip of a tether, but it was the first time in 3 years I didn't feel obligated to listen to their noise. The doorbell rang again at 4 o'clock. This time Derek was alone. I watched him from the front window, standing on the porch with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked exhausted, his expensive tuxedo shirt from the night before, now wrinkled and stained at the collar. I didn't open the door. I walked out onto the porch and leaned against the railing, keeping the screen door between us. "I'm not letting you in, Derek," I said. My voice was steady, the same tone I used when I had to tell a foreman that a slab was poured incorrectly. "Lay, please," he whispered. He looked down at the wooden slats of the porch. "I didn't come to argue. I don't have anywhere to go. I went back to the apartment on High Street this morning. The locks were changed there too. I thought you had sublet it for me like we planned." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a strange flicker of pity that died almost as soon as it was born. "Why was the lock changed, Derek?" He wiped a hand across his face, his shoulders sagging. "My mother sold the lease 6 months ago, Lee. She told me she needed the money to pay off some credit card debt. She said it didn't matter because we were moving into your house anyway. She told me you didn't need to know because we were going to be a family. Everything would be shared." I felt a cold shiver go down my arms, but it wasn't from the October breeze. It was the clarity of the trap. She didn't just plan a speech. She dismantled his life so he would have no choice but to rely on my house, my income, and her rules. "And you let her," I said. "You knew for half a year that you were effectively homeless without me, and you didn't say a word." "I thought she knew what she was doing," he said, his voice cracking. "I thought it was for the best. A year ago, those words would have broken me. I would have opened the door, made him a cup of coffee, and started fixing his life, because that was what I did. I was a builder. I fixed things. But as I looked at him now, I realized he wasn't a project. He was a choice, and he had chosen to be a passenger in his own life while his mother drove us both off a cliff." "You need to call your mother, Derek," I said. I turned around and walked back into the house, closing the heavy oak door behind me. I heard him call my name once, a weak, pathetic sound, before his footsteps faded away down the driveway. I went into the kitchen to find Paige, but the house felt suddenly tight, like a shoe that was 2 sizes too small. At 7 o'clock, my phone rang. It wasn't a Barton. It was Kyle Ross, my direct supervisor at the construction firm. Kyle was a man of few words, usually focused on concrete PSI and steel grades, but his voice sounded strained. "Lay, I hate to call you on a Saturday," he began, clearing his throat. "But I had a very strange call from the Human Resources Department about an hour ago. A woman called in claiming to be a relative of yours. She was very distressed, saying you were going through a severe emotional instability and that we should keep an eye on your professional decisions. She mentioned something about you being unfit to handle the Worthington project right now." I sat down at the kitchen table, my hand tightening around my mug. The ceramic felt hot against my palm. "What did HR say, Kyle?" "They haven't opened a formal case yet, but they had to make a note of it," he said. "Look, I've worked with you for 6 years. I know you're the most stable person on my team. But this woman, she was very persistent. She said she was worried about your mental health after the wedding was cancelled. I took a deep breath, feeling the anger sharpen into something cold and jagged. I understand, Kyle. Thank you for telling me. I'm perfectly fine. In fact, I've never been more clear-headed. I'll be in on Monday morning to walk the site at Worthington. I hung up and looked at Paige. She was watching me, her eyes wide. She's going after your job. That's low even for her. It's not just my job, I said. It's my reputation. She's trying to prove her own point. She said I needed that family more than they needed me. Now she's trying to take away everything else, so I have no choice but to crawl back. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder Gail had given me. My fingers brushed against the third page, the one I had been avoiding. I hadn't wanted to see the full extent of the rot, but Connie Barton had just stepped onto my professional turf. She was trying to compromise the integrity of my career. I took a sip of my cold tea and felt the decision settle in my gut. I opened my laptop and typed a quick message to Gail Foster. I didn't care what time it was. I need to read the full thread I wrote. Send it all. I want to see every single word they said about me. I sat there in the dark kitchen, the only light coming from the glowing screen. I had spent my life making sure foundations were solid, that structures were safe, and that people could trust the roof over their heads. I had been so busy building a life that I hadn't noticed someone was pouring salt into the concrete. The notification pinged, an email from Gail. Attached was a file titled Barton Thread Full. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. I felt the way I did before a major demolition. I was just waiting for the signal to clear the area. Gail sent the email at 9:30 on Saturday night. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the only light coming from the small pendant lamp that hung over the granite island. The rest of the house was draped in shadows, a quiet that felt heavy and expectant. Paige sat across from me, her chin resting in her hands, watching the loading bar on my laptop screen. The glow from the monitor cast a blue clinical light over her face. We didn't speak. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional tap of rain against the window pane. When the file finally downloaded, I hesitated. My cursor hovered over the icon. I knew that once I clicked, the version of Derek I had loved for 3 years would officially cease to exist. He would be replaced by the man in these messages, a man who had participated in a 3-month-long excavation of my life. I clicked. The thread began in mid-August. The messages were short, clinical, and devastatingly organized. I scrolled to the 14th of August. Connie's name appeared in bold at the top of the screen. Her words were a sharp contrast to the soft motherly voice she used in person. Derek, I need you to let me handle this at the wedding, she had written. When she hears this in front of everyone, she won't make a scene. She values her reputation too much. I felt my jaw tighten. My teeth ached from a pressure I hadn't realized I was applying. I looked at Derek's reply sent 4 minutes later. Are you sure Mom Lee isn't exactly the type to just go along with things? Connie's response was immediate. I know exactly the type she is. She wants to be needed. I will show her how much she is needed. Just stay the course. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking under my weight. Paige reached out her fingers, brushing my arm. Leigh, do you want me to take it? She whispered. I shook my head. I needed to see every inch of the rot. I needed to know exactly how much of my life had been a performance. By 10:15, I had moved the laptop to the living room. I needed more space, more air. I sat on the moss green sofa I had bought with my first major bonus, a piece of furniture Derek had once complained was too firm. I pulled my knees to my chest, a habit from when I was a child, trying to make myself invisible. Paige called Gail on a video link, and the lawyer's face appeared on the screen. She looked exhausted, her hair messy, but her eyes were like steel. Gail explained where the rest of the messages came from. Paige had seen Derek's phone on the head table at the venue on Friday night. It had been buzzing incessantly with notifications from Connie. When Paige went to silence it, the thread had been open. She had taken 23 screenshots in a feverish blur before putting the phone back. She hadn't told me because she hadn't known what they meant until she saw the look on my face at the dinner table. Gail shared her screen showing the full chronological descent. I read them in silence. September 2nd. Connie, I will make the expectations clear. In front of everyone. When she hears it before a crowd, she won't protest. She doesn't want to cause a spectacle. Derek, I'm not sure this is a good idea. Connie, you don't need to be sure. You just need to do nothing. I'll handle it. The messages continue through the fall, a slow, methodical tightening of the noose. October 8th, 3 days before the wedding. Derek, Mom, I'm still worried. Lay is practical. If you say those things, you need to be ready for her to react. Connie's final message in that stretch was the one that stayed with me. The one that made the air in the room feel thin. She won't do anything, Derek. She needs this family more than this family needs her. Trust your mother. I stared at the words until they blurred into black streaks. She needs this family more than this family needs her. Connie Barton didn't just want a daughter-in-law. She wanted a project. She saw my independence as a debt that needed to be paid, and she saw my love for her son as a weakness to be exploited. But the most bitter pill wasn't Connie's malice. It was Derek's silence. He had seen the blueprints for my humiliation. He had watched his mother build the gallows, and he had simply stood by waiting for the floor to drop. He hadn't fought for me. He hadn't even warned me. He had chosen the comfort of his mother's control over the integrity of our partnership. A strange cold clarity washed over me. It was the feeling I got when I finally identified the point of failure in a collapsed structure. Once you see the sheared bolt, you stop wondering why the bridge fell. You just start clearing the debris. I looked at Paige. She was watching me, her eyes full of a sympathy I couldn't quite accept yet. How many people at that wedding were actually his friends, Paige? I asked. Not our mutual friends. His... She thought for a moment. Maybe 8 or 9, she said. The rest were yours. Or people you work with. I nodded. I paid for 80% of that wedding. I bought this house. I paid the shared bills for 14 months while he looked for a new firm. And she thinks I am the one who is desperate for a place at their table. I stood up and walked back to the kitchen, my movements stiff. I poured the remains of my tea into the sink and watched it swirl down the drain. Gail was still on the screen watching me with a quiet professional patience. Do you have a plan? Gail asked. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, an invitation to action. I don't have a plan yet, I said, looking at the 2 new silver keys sitting on the counter. But I am a structural engineer, Gail. I don't start construction until I have a verified blueprint, and I've just finished the survey. Connie Barton thought she knew the type of woman I was. She thought I was a woman who would endure a public branding because I was afraid of being alone. She thought my need to be useful was a chain she could pull. She didn't realize that the reason I am useful is because I know how to dismantle things that are no longer safe. I looked at my phone. 67 missed calls. The number was a monument to their panic. They weren't calling because they loved me. They were calling because the bank was closed, the house was locked, and the woman they thought they owned had walked out of the frame. I'm going to show her exactly how much I need them, I whispered. I sat down at my desk in the corner of the bedroom. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, the kind with the blue grid lines I used for sketches. I drew a line down the middle. On one side, I wrote, what they think I have. On the other, I wrote, what I actually have. Under the second column, I wrote, documentation, equity, reputation, Gail, Paige. I paused, then added one more line at the very bottom. The truth. I folded the paper and tucked it into my top drawer. The rain was coming down harder now, a steady drumming on the roof that felt like a heartbeat. I wasn't a bride anymore. I wasn't a member of the Barton family. I was just Lee Donovan, and for the first time in 3 years, I knew exactly where I stood. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark. Tomorrow was Sunday. Connie would likely try to come back. Derek would likely try to plead, but they were playing a game I had already quit. I wasn't just walking away from a wedding. I was clearing the side for something entirely new. The sun had barely cleared the horizon on Sunday morning when the first ripples of Connie's new strategy hit my shore. I was standing in the kitchen, the floorboards cold against my bare feet, waiting for the kettle to whistle. My phone, which I had left on the granite island, vibrated with a persistence that felt like a physical intrusion. It wasn't a call. It was a text from Sarah, one of the junior engineers at Meridian Construction. Sarah was 24, eager to please, and generally stayed out of office politics. "Hey Lay," the message read. "I just had the strangest call. A woman named Connie said she was your mother-in-law and that she was worried about you. She said you'd had a breakdown and might not be coming in tomorrow. Is everything okay? Do I need to cover your site visit at Worthington?" I stared at the screen until the words blurred. The kettle began to shriek a sharp, piercing sound that mirrored the sudden tightening in my chest. I didn't feel the heat of the steam as I reached for the handle. I felt cold. Connie wasn't just calling my house anymore. Bat was calling my professional world using the RSVP list she'd pilfered from the wedding planning folder to find names and titles. Bat was planting seeds of doubt in the minds of the people who worked for me. 10 minutes later, another message arrived. This one was from Mark, our lead surveyor. Same story. Connie had called, her voice trembling with manufactured concern, asking if Leigh had been acting erratic lately. Ba was playing the role of the grieving matriarch, trying to protect her fragile daughter-in-law from the pressures of a high-stakes job. Paige came into the kitchen, her hair messy from sleep, rubbing her face. She saw me staring at the phone and didn't even have to ask. "Ba's at it again, isn't she?" Paige muttered, reaching for a mug. "She called Sarah and Mark," I said. "Ba's telling them I've had a breakdown. Ba's trying to get me removed from the Worthington project before I even walk into the office on Monday morning." Paige leaned against the counter, her eyes widening. "That's more than just being a difficult mother-in-law, Lee. That's a coordinated strike. Ba's trying to cut off your legs so you have to lean on them." I didn't answer. I walked to the window and watched a cardinal land on the bird feeder. Connie Barton knew exactly what Ba was doing. In the construction world, reputation was the only currency that mattered. If a lead engineer was considered unstable, the clients would pull the contracts. The firm would pull the lead. Ba wasn't just trying to win an argument. Ba was trying to destroy the only foundation I had left. The morning dragged on with a heavy, oppressive stillness. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a jolt of ice in my veins. At 11 o'clock, Derek sent a text. For the first time, he didn't lead with an excuse for his mother. "Give me 10 minutes," he wrote. "Not at the house. Somewhere neutral." I looked at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to delete it and go back to my blueprints. But another part, the engineer that needed to see the full extent of the structural failure, knew I had to go. I needed to see if there was any part of the man I loved that was still standing, or if the whole building had already collapsed. We met at a small coffee shop 3 blocks from my house. It was a place we used to go on Sunday mornings to talk about our future. Now the smell of roasted beans and the sound of the espresso machine felt like a mockery. Derek was already there, sitting at a corner table, with his hands wrapped around a paper cup. He looked like he hadn't slept since Friday night. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a tremor in his fingers that he couldn't hide. I sat down across from him, keeping my coat on. I didn't order anything. I just watched him. "I love you, Leigh," he started. His voice was a rasp barely audible over the chatter of the other customers. "I love you in the only way I know how. I know it hasn't been enough. I know I've let her drive." I looked at his hands. They were the hands that had held mine during my father's funeral. They were the hands that had helped me move my heaviest drafting table into the house. But they were also the hands that had remained idle while his mother tried to brand me like cattle. "Did you ever tell her it was wrong, Derek?" I asked. I wasn't angry. I was just tired. "When Ba told you 3 months ago that Ba was going to give that speech, did you tell her no? Did you tell her that I was your partner, not your project?" Derek looked away, his gaze fixed on a crack in the linoleum floor. "I told her I wasn't sure it was a good idea," he whispered. "I told her you were practical and might react poorly." "That's not what I asked," I said. The clarity of the moment was like a laser cutting through the fog of the last 3 years. "I didn't ask if you were worried about my reaction. I asked if you told her it was wrong to lie to me. I asked if you defended the woman you were supposedly committing your life to." He didn't answer. The silence was the only confirmation I needed. Derek didn't value the truth. He valued peace, and in the Barton family, peace was only achieved through total submission to Connie's narrative. "Is there really nothing left to save?" he asked, finally looking up. His eyes were pleading, but it was the plea of a child who had broken a window and wanted someone else to fix it. I looked at him and realized that I didn't feel the urge to fix him anymore. I don't know what you think there is to save Derek. I was never a woman who needed to be rescued. I was a woman who wanted a partner. You chose to be an observer. I stood up and walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. The autumn air felt sharper, now a premonition of the winter to come. I drove home with the windows down, letting the wind whip through the car, trying to wash away the smell of his desperation. When I got back to the house, Paige was waiting on the back porch. The sky was a bruised purple, the sun dipping below the line of the neighborhood trees. Ba had her laptop open, and the expression on her face made my heart skip a beat. "You need to see this," Paige said. Ba turned the screen toward me. It was a post on Facebook from Brenda Knox, Derek's aunt. It was public, meant for anyone to see. "Please pray for our family," it read. "We are dealing with the heartbreak of a broken home caused by a woman who doesn't understand her place or the value of a godly family. Sometimes all the money and career success in the world can't buy virtue or grace. It is a tragedy when pride comes before the fall." There were 47 likes, 23 comments from people I had seen smiling at me just 48 hours ago. They were calling me arrogant. They were calling me ungrateful. They were weaving a story where I was the villain who had crushed poor sweet Derek's heart because I was too proud to be a wife. I sat down on the steps of the porch, the wood cold against my jeans. This was the cost. It wasn't just losing a husband. It was losing the version of myself that lived in the minds of others. Connie and her sisters were going to tell this story until it became the truth in the eyes of the community. They were going to burn my reputation to the ground to keep themselves warm. I looked out at my backyard. The grass needed mowing. I'd planned to do it weeks ago, but I'd been too busy coordinating the floral arrangements and the seating charts. I'd been building a stage for my own execution. "Can I live with this?" I whispered to the empty yard. "Can I walk into a grocery store or a job site knowing that they've told everyone I'm a monster?" I remembered my father's old drafting table. He hadn't been a perfect man, but he taught me one thing: a bridge doesn't care what you think about it. It only cares if the math is right. If the math is right, it stands. If it's wrong, it falls. Connie Barton's math was wrong. Ba thought my value came from her approval. Ba thought Ba could take away my dignity by calling my boss or posting on social media. But Ba couldn't take away the fact that I was the one who paid the bills. Ba couldn't take away the fact that I held the deed to the house Derek wanted to live in. Ba was trying to set fire to a house Ba didn't own. I stood up and felt a cold, hard resolve settle into my bones. It wasn't the heat of revenge. It was the calculated chill of a demolition expert. "Paige," I said, walking back into the kitchen. "Do you have Kyle Ross's personal cell number?" "Why?" Paige asked, looking up from the laptop. "Because Connie called HR to tell them I was unstable," I said. I reached for my phone. "I'm going to call Kyle. I'm going to tell him exactly what happened at that dinner. And then I'm going to tell him that I'll be at the Worthington site at 7 a.m. tomorrow morning, exactly as scheduled. I'm going to tell my own story before Ba can finish hers." I called Kyle. The conversation lasted only 4 minutes. I didn't cry. I didn't offer excuses. I gave him the facts of the recording and the situation with the house. Kyle was silent for a long beat after I finished. "I know who you are, Lee," he said. "I've seen your work for 6 years. Don't worry about HR. I'll handle them. Just get some sleep. We have a lot of concrete to pour tomorrow." I hung up and looked at the phone. There were 112 missed calls now. The number was staggering, a digital wall of noise. I looked at the audio file of the wedding speech. Then I looked at the contact information for the HR department at Derek's firm. Connie wanted to play a game of reputations. Ba wanted to see who could scream the loudest. I wasn't going to scream. I was just going to provide the data. I sat down at my desk and began to draft a statement. I wasn't just a victim of a bad mother-in-law. I was a professional who was being harassed, and I had the screenshots to prove it. The night was dark, now the only light in the house coming from my desk lamp. I felt like I was back at a construction site, looking at a failed support beam. You don't ignore it. You don't hope it fixes itself. You cut it out, and you replace it with something that can actually hold the weight. I was done being the woman who made herself useful. I was going to be the woman who stood her ground. Monday morning arrived with a sky the color of unpolished pewter. I didn't wait for the sun to fully commit to the day before I was out the door, my work boots echoing against the concrete of my driveway. The air was sharp, smelling of wet pavement and the first hint of winter. I reached for my thermos in the cup holder and felt the steady rhythmic hum of the engine beneath my seat. It was a grounding vibration, a reminder that while my personal life had been stripped to the studs, my professional world was built on reinforced steel. I arrived at the Worthington site at 6:45. The massive skeleton of the future medical center loomed against the gray clouds, a tangled web of rebar and crane arms. I stepped out of my truck, pulled my high-visibility vest over my jacket, and snapped my hard hat into place. The familiar weight of my tool belt felt like armor. Morning Laymark called out from the surveyor's trailer. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me the way he always did, with a clipboard in one hand and a furrowed brow. "We have a discrepancy on the southpaw. The inspector is going to be here at 9. I nodded, my mind immediately shifting into the gear it knew best. "Let's look at the specs," I said. We spent the next 2 hours climbing through the dust and the noise. I didn't think about the wedding dress on my bedroom floor or the 100+ missed calls. I thought about load distribution and tensile strength. I walked the perimeter of the foundation, checking the placement of the anchor bolts. My boots were caked in orange mud by 8:30, and my hands were cold, but I felt more like myself than I had in years. I wasn't a bride. I wasn't a daughter-in-law. I was the lead structural engineer on a $40 million project. Just as the city inspector's white SUV pulled into the site, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I stepped away from the noise of a generator to answer it. It was Gail. "Lay, I've just been served," she said. Her voice was tight, the professional mask slipping just enough for me to hear the irritation underneath. "Connie Barton has filed for a temporary restraining order on Derek's behalf. She's claiming you are a danger to yourself and others, and she's requesting an emergency hearing to grant Derek access to the house to retrieve his essentials." I leaned against a stack of plywood, watching the inspector shake hands with Mark. "A danger to myself," I repeated. "I just spent 2 hours verifying the structural integrity of a 5-story building." "I know," Gail said. "It's a desperate move. She's trying to create a paper trail of instability to back up those calls she made to your HR department. She wants a judge to see you as the hysterical woman who snapped. We have a hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning at 10. I've already contacted the locksmith and the venue coordinator for their statements." I looked at my mud-stained boots. "She's not going to stop until I'm completely dismantled, is she?" Gail paused. "People like Connie don't know how to stop Lay. They only know how to win." "But she's playing a short game. We're playing the long one." "I'll meet you at my office at 6 tonight. Bring the laptop." I hung up and walked back to the inspector. For the rest of the day, I functioned on pure habit. I spoke about concrete sigh and drainage slopes. I signed off on reports. But in the back of my mind, a new blueprint was forming. Connie wanted to use the legal system as a sledgehammer. Fine, I would use it as a scalpel. When I reached Gail's office that evening, the city lights were just beginning to flicker on. The office was quiet, the air smelling of old coffee and radiator heat. Paige was already there, sitting on the edge of a leather chair, her fingers twisting a loose thread on her sweater. Gail didn't waste time. She opened a manila folder and laid out a series of bank statements. I recognized the account numbers. They were Derek's, or rather, they were the joint account he had insisted we set up for wedding expenses. I went through the line items, Gail said, pointing to a series of withdrawals from August and September, totaling $15,000, all transferred to an account owned by Connie Barton. I felt a dull ache behind my eyes. "That was the catering deposit," I whispered. "And the flowers. I put that money in there from my savings." "She was using your wedding fund to pay off her own debts, while telling Derek she was doing him a favor by handling the logistics," Gail said. "And there's more. Look at the date of the lease termination on High Street." I looked at the paper, September 15th, a month before the wedding. "She left him with no exit strategy," I said. the realization hitting me like a physical blow. She made sure he had nowhere to go but my house. She wasn't just planning a speech, she was planning a takeover. The door to the office opened and Gail's assistant stepped in, looking pale. "There's a woman in the lobby," she said. "She says her name is Connie Barton. She's demanding to speak with Leigh. She says she has a right to be here because this is a family matter." Gail stood up, her jaw set. "I'll handle this." "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "I'll handle it." I walked down the narrow hallway, my heels clicking on the hardwood. I could see Connie through the glass doors of the lobby. She was wearing a navy blue suit and a string of pearls, her hair perfectly coiffed. She looked like the image of a concerned mother, but when she saw me, her eyes narrowed into something sharp and cold. "Leigh," she said, as I pushed open the door. Her voice was loud enough for the entire floor to hear. "I'm so disappointed in you. To involve lawyers in a family dispute, to lock Derek out of his own home. This isn't who you are." I didn't stop until I was 3 feet away from her. I could smell her perfume, that cloying, suffocating white shoulders. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show her the anger that was simmering in my chest. "You have exactly 30 seconds to leave this office, Connie," I said. "Don't you take that tone with me," she snapped, her mask slipping. "I am trying to save my son from a woman who clearly has no respect for the sanctity of a union. I have filed the paperwork. The court will see what you are." I leaned in just an inch. "I have the bank statements, Connie. I have the record of the $15,000 you took from the wedding account. I have the lease termination from High Street. And I have the recording of your speech." Connie's face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks until she looked like a marble statue. "That was for the family," she stammered. "I was managing the assets. You were stealing from me," I said. "And tomorrow morning I'm going to show a judge exactly how much you managed. I'm going to show them the texts where you plan to humiliate me. I'm going to show them that you're not a concerned mother. You're a thief in a pearl necklace." Connie stepped back, her hand flying to her throat. "You wouldn't dare. It would ruin Derek's reputation." "Derek's reputation died the moment he let you write his life for him," I said. "Now get out." She stared at me for 5 long seconds. I saw the gears turning, the desperate search for a new angle, a new way to spin the narrative. But for the first time in her life, she was looking at a structure she couldn't break. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. She turned on her heel and walked out, the glass door swinging shut behind her with a heavy final thud. I stood in the lobby for a moment, listening to the silence. My hands were shaking just a little, but it wasn't from fear. It was the release of 3 years of pressure. I walked back into Gail's office and sat down. "She's going to fight," Gail said, watching me. "She's going to use everything she has tomorrow." "Let her," I said. I looked at the folder of evidence on the desk. I've spent my life building things to code Gail. I know exactly what it takes to bring a crooked house down. I went home that night and slept for 8 hours. No dreams, no interruptions. On Tuesday morning, I put on my best charcoal suit and met Gail at the courthouse. The building was an old stone monument to order and law, its high ceilings echoing with the footsteps of people looking for justice. Connie and Derek were already there, sitting on a wooden bench outside the courtroom. Derek wouldn't look at me. He looked like a shadow of a person, his suit hanging loose on his frame. Connie was whispering in his ear, her hand on his arm, the puppet master still trying to pull the strings, even as the stage was burning. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. Connie's lawyer tried to paint a picture of a distraught bride who had gone on a vengeful rampage. He spoke about the locks, the abandoned wedding guests, the perceived instability. He used words like emotional volatility and erratic behavior. Then Gail stood up. She didn't make a speech. She didn't appeal to emotion. She simply presented the evidence. She played 30 seconds of the wedding recording. She submitted the bank statements. She submitted the lease termination. The judge, a woman in her 60s with eyes that had seen every version of human greed, looked at the papers for a long time. She looked at Connie, who was sitting up straight, her chin tilted at an angle of practiced defiance. Then she looked at Derek. "Mr. Barton," the judge said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "Did you authorize your mother to withdraw $15,000 from your joint account for her personal debts?" Derek hesitated. He looked at Connie. She gave him a sharp, microscopic nod. Yes, Your Honor, he whispered. And did you know your lease was terminated a month before the wedding? The judge asked. Yes, Your Honor. The judge closed the file with a snap. Request for a restraining order is denied. Furthermore, I am ordering a full accounting of the wedding funds to be submitted to this court within 10 days. Mr. Barton, you have 48 hours to arrange for a third party to retrieve any personal belongings from the residence on Miller Avenue. You are not to set foot on the property yourself. We walked out of the courtroom into the bright afternoon sun. Connie was white with rage, her hands clenched at her sides. Derek was staring at the ground, finally looking like he understood the gravity of what he had lost. I didn't stop to talk to them. I walked straight to my car. Connie screamed from the courthouse steps. You'll regret this. You're alone. You have nothing. I started the engine and looked at her in the rearview mirror. She was a small, angry woman standing in front of a massive stone building. She thought I was alone because I didn't have her version of a family. She didn't realize that, for the first time in 3 years, I had a foundation that was finally truly level. I drove back to the Worthington site. I parked my car, put on my hard hat, and walked back onto the grid of steel and concrete. Mark saw me and waved a hand toward the north section. Inspector's back, he yelled over the sound of a jackhammer. He wants to see the pour. I took a deep breath of the dusty cold air and felt the strength in my own limbs. I had spent so much time trying to build a life for someone else that I had forgotten I was the one holding the tools. I walked toward the north section, my steps steady on the uneven ground. The building was going up. The math was right, and I was exactly where I belonged. The fluorescent lights of the Franklin County Courthouse hummed with a low electric vibration that seemed to vibrate right through the soles of my shoes. I stood by the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, watching the dust motes dance in a stray beam of afternoon light. The victory in front of the judge should have felt like a finished blueprint, a clean handoff of a completed project. But as I watched Connie Barton huddle with her lawyer at the far end of the hallway, her hands gesturing wildly, I knew the structural demolition was only halfway done. She was still standing. Her reputation in the Barton family circle was still intact, a reinforced wall that hadn't yet felt the weight of the wrecking ball. Derek was a shadow beside her, his shoulders slumped so low he looked like he was trying to fold into himself. He caught my eye for a fleeting second, and I saw something there that wasn't anger. It was the vacant hollow stare of a building that had been gutted from the inside out. I turned away. I didn't have any more materials to give him. My inventory of forgiveness had run dry at the wedding table. I walked toward the elevators with Gail my heels clicking a sharp, steady rhythm on the marble floor. We didn't speak until we were inside the sliding metal doors. The elevator dropped that familiar lurch in my stomach, reminding me of the night I left the reception. You realize she's going to spend the next 48 hours spinning this as a judicial mistake, Gail said, her voice clinical and calm. She's already texting. I saw her thumbs moving before we even left the bench. By tonight, the Barton family narrative will be that the judge was biased and you're a manipulative mastermind who tricked the court. I looked at my reflection in the polished brass of the elevator door. My hair was pulled back tight. My suit was unwrinkled. I looked like a woman who dealt in facts, and that was exactly why Connie's lies were so effective. Facts are boring. Lies are a story. I'm not going to let her tell the story anymore, Gail, I said. I reached into my bag and felt the weight of the flash drive containing the full recording of the wedding dinner and the bank statements. I've spent my career making sure things are built to code so they don't collapse on people. Connie is a walking safety hazard. It's time to issue the violation notice. I drove home in a silence so thick it felt like physical pressure. When I pulled into my driveway on Miller Avenue, the house looked different. The blue door I had painted myself seemed brighter, sharper against the gray Ohio sky. This was my territory. I walked inside and found Paige in the kitchen, a bottle of wine already open on the counter, and 3 different laptops spread across the table. We're going live, aren't we? Paige asked her, eyes bright, with a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. We're going to give them the data, I said. I sat down and opened the Barton family Facebook group. It was a private sanctuary of curated perfection, filled with photos of church, potlucks, graduation announcements, and coordinated Christmas sweaters. It was the source of Connie's power. It was where she built the myth of the perfect family. I scrolled through the recent posts. There it was posted only 20 minutes ago by Aunt Brenda. A tragic day for justice, the post read. Watching a good man like Derek be slandered by someone he trusted is a cross we all must bear. We will persevere through faith. I felt a cold, sharp laugh bubble up in my throat. I didn't type a response. I didn't engage with the comments. Instead, I uploaded the audio file from the wedding. I titled it The Full Speech. Below it, I uploaded a high-resolution scan of the bank transfer showing $15,000 moving from the wedding fund to Connie's personal debt consolidation account. I added the lease termination document for Derek's apartment. I didn't add a long caption. I didn't use adjectives. I simply wrote, "For those who value the truth over the narrative, here are the facts of the last 3 months." I hit post. For the first 5 minutes, the screen was still. I sat there, my hand on the mouse, watching the little spinning icon. Then the first notification popped up. Then 10, then 30. The group, which usually saw maybe 5 posts a week, exploded. I watched the comments roll in like a landslide. Who authorized this transfer? Is that really Connie's voice? Derek, did you know about the apartment? The wall of silence that Connie had built around her son was cracking in real time. I saw cousins questioning aunts. I saw siblings demanding explanations. The Barton family, the one Connie claimed was a solid, unbreakable unit, was turning on itself because for the first time, they had a blueprint of the lie. The phone started ringing at 7 p.m. It wasn't Connie. It was Brenda. I let it go to voicemail. Then it was Derek's sister Megan. I let that go too. I wasn't interested in their shock. I was interested in the demolition. At 8:15, there was a heavy rhythmic pounding on my front door. Not the frantic scratching of Connie's nails, but a solid masculine thud. I looked through the sidelight. It was Derek. He was alone and he was holding a cardboard box. I opened the door, but I didn't let him inside. I stood on the threshold, the cool night air rushing past me. "You posted the bank statements," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of the pleading tone he'd used at the coffee shop. My sister just called me crying. "My mother is locked in her bedroom. You've ruined her, Lee." I looked at the box in his hands. It contained a few pairs of shoes, a desk lamp, and a stack of books. The sum total of his contribution to our home. "She ruined herself, Derek," I said. "I didn't move an inch. I just provided the documentation. If the truth ruins her, then her entire life was built on a lie." How does it feel to see the math, Derek? How does it feel to see exactly how much your mother thinks your future is worth? $15,000. That's the price she put on our wedding. He looked at the shoes in the box, his jaw working. "I didn't know about the money," he whispered. "I swear, Lay, I thought she was just helping." "Ignorance is just another way of being an accomplice," I told him. I reached out and took the box from his hands. It was light, unexpectedly light. I set it down on the porch behind me. "You have 30 minutes to get the rest of your things from the garage. The third-party coordinator Gail mentioned will be here at 9 to supervise. Don't come back to the porch." "Lay, wait," he said, reaching out as if to catch the door. I looked at his hand, then back at his face. The man I loved was a fiction I had spent 3 years writing. The man standing on my porch was a stranger who lived in his mother's shadow. The door clicked shut. I locked the deadbolt. I walked back into the kitchen and sat down across from Paige. She was staring at her phone, her mouth slightly open. "Connie just got kicked out of the family group," Paige said, her voice hushed. "Her own sisters removed her. They're posting about the money now. Apparently she owed Brenda $5,000 too." I picked up my wine glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. The wine was crisp and cold. I looked around my kitchen at the granite counters I had paid for and the light fixtures I had chosen. The structure was finally clear. The debris was being hauled away. I spent the next hour watching through the window as a neutral courier helped Derek load the rest of his boxes into his car. He didn't look back at the house. He didn't look back at the life we had planned. He just drove away into the dark, his taillights fading into the distance. I went to my bedroom and looked at the wedding dress. It was still there, a pile of expensive lace and broken promises on the floor. I picked it up. It felt heavy, a dead weight in my arms. I didn't cry. I didn't feel a surge of regret. I just walked it down to the basement and put it in a storage bin. I labeled it with a black marker, scrapped materials. When I came back upstairs, Paige was folding her blankets on the sofa. She looked at me, a soft smile on her face. "What now?" she asked. "Now," I said, "I go to work tomorrow. I finished the Worthington project. And then I think I'm going to take a long look at the structural integrity of my own life. I've spent too much time worrying about the load-bearing walls of other people's houses." I turned off the lights in the living room one by one. The house was quiet, but for the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt solid. It felt like a foundation that had been tested by a storm and had held firm. I walked to my room, closed the door, and slept a deep, dreamless sleep, knowing that when the sun came up, I wouldn't have to translate anyone else's lies. I was the architect now, and my plans were exactly where they needed to be. The gravel in my driveway had barely settled from the weight of Derek's departing tires when the silence of the house began to change. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of a secret being kept. It was the vast open silence of a construction site after the debris has been cleared and the land is finally leveled. I stood in the center of my living room, the moonlight cutting across the hardwood floors in long silver ribs. For 3 years, I had walked through these rooms, trying to fit myself into the shape of a woman Connie Barton would approve of. I had moved furniture to accommodate his comfort. I had dimmed the lights to soften my own edges. I reached out and touched the wall. The plaster was cool and solid. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like an architect who had just discovered the original blueprints to a house she'd forgotten she owned. Paige walked in from the kitchen, her footsteps light. She didn't say anything at first. She just handed me a fresh mug of tea, the steam curling between us like a white flag. She sat on the edge of the sofa watching me with that quiet, steady gaze that had seen me through every failed inspection and every late-night deadline for a decade. "He's gone, Lay," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of structural fact. "He was never really here, Paige," I replied. I walked over to the window and looked at the empty street. He was just a tenant in a space I was paying for. I was the one maintaining the roof. I was the one checking the foundation. He was just enjoying the view until his mother told him the weather was changing. I sat down at the mahogany desk in the corner of the room. I pulled out a fresh legal pad, the yellow paper bright under the desk lamp. I didn't start writing a manifesto. I didn't start a journal entry about my feelings. I drew a single straight line down the center of the page. On the left side, I wrote the cost of maintenance. On the right side, I wrote the value of the ground. I thought about the thousands of women who had sat in rooms just like this one, listening to the echoes of a husband's footsteps, leaving and wondering if they were enough. I thought about the women who had been told that their independence was a flaw, that their strength was a threat, and that their silence was the only thing keeping their families together. Connie Barton hadn't just stolen $15,000. She had tried to steal the language I used to define myself. She had tried to convince me that the house I built with my own hands was a prison unless she held the keys. "I'm going to start a series, Paige," I said, my pen hovering over the paper. "I'm going to show them how to read their own blueprints. I'm going to show them that a family isn't a structure you're trapped in. It's a structure you build together. And if the math doesn't add up, you have every right to walk off the site." I spent the next 4 hours writing. I didn't use the words of a therapist. I used the words of a builder. I wrote about the invisible load, not the emotional weight, but the literal distribution of energy. I wrote about how to spot a soft story, a relationship that looks beautiful on the outside but lacks the sheer walls necessary to survive a tremor. I wrote about the importance of sole ownership, not just of property, but of one's own narrative. As the sun began to bleed through the clouds on Wednesday morning, I posted the first entry. I didn't tag Connie. I didn't mention Derek. I titled it, "The Structural Integrity of the Self." When you buy a house, I wrote, the first thing you do is check the foundation. You look for cracks, you look for water damage. You don't ignore a sinking corner because you like the color of the shutters. Why do we treat our lives any differently? Why do we stay in structures that are literally groaning under the weight of someone else's expectations? I hit send and walked away. By noon, the responses started coming in. They weren't the sharp, biting comments from the day before. They were whispers. Women sharing their own stories of financial control and emotional erosion. I realized then that the revenge wasn't the ending. It was just the side preparation. The real work was the rebuilding. The Worthington site became my sanctuary during the day. I stood on the 5th floor, the wind whipping around the steel girders, and watched the city below. My crew worked with a new kind of precision. They saw me differently now. I wasn't the woman who almost married a Barton. I was the engineer who had survived a high-profile collapse without blinking. But the real transformation was happening in the evenings. I started hosting blueprint nights in my kitchen. It started with Paige and 2 other women from the firm, but soon even some of the Barton cousins reached out. They came with notebooks and questions. We didn't talk about Derek. We talked about bank accounts, deeds, and the legal definition of separate property. We talked about how to say no to a matriarch without feeling like the world was ending. One night, Brenda Knox showed up. She looked smaller than she had in the courthouse, her usual armor of pearls and poise replaced by a simple cardigan and a look of deep uncertainty. She sat at my table, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea. I've spent 30 years thinking that suffering was a virtue, Brenda whispered, her eyes fixed on the blueprints I had spread out on the counter. I thought that if I just held the walls up long enough, Connie would finally tell me I'd done a good job. I didn't realize that the house was already empty. I reached out and placed my hand over hers. The house isn't empty, Brenda. You're still in it. You just need to decide if you want to keep paying the rent on a place that makes you feel small. That was the moment the spin-off truly took flight. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about the structural reform of an entire social circle. I started a nonprofit called the Foundation Project, dedicated to providing financial and legal literacy for women coming out of high-control family dynamics. We used my case as a teaching tool, not to shame Derek, but to highlight the warning signs of structural failure. 6 months later, I stood in front of a classroom of 40 women. I wasn't wearing a wedding dress. I was wearing my work boots and a blazer. I looked at their faces, hopeful, terrified, and resilient. Every building has a tipping point, I told them, a moment where the load becomes greater than the capacity of the material. For some of us, that moment happens at a dinner table. For others, it's a slow realization over a decades-long mortgage. But the beauty of being a builder is that you always have the power to redesign. You can tear down the walls that don't serve you. You can pour a new slab. You can choose exactly who gets a key to your front door. As I walked out of the community center that night, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. I saw your interview on the local news, it read. You look happy. I'm still trying to find where I put my tools. I didn't reply. I didn't feel the need to. I simply blocked the number and kept walking toward my car. The night air was cool, smelling of damp earth and the promise of rain. I looked up at the skyscraper I was helping to build, its lights twinkling against the dark sky. It was strong, it was honest, and it was standing on its own. I drove home to Miller Avenue. I unlocked my blue door and stepped inside. The house didn't feel empty, it felt complete. I walked to my desk, picked up a fresh yellow pad, and began to draft the next lesson for the Foundation Project. Lesson 5, Recognizing Load-Bearing Lies. I smiled the light from my desk lamp, casting a warm glow over the page. The demolition was a memory. The construction was my life. And for the first time, I knew exactly how much weight I could carry. The heavy ornate silver frames that used to line my fireplace mantel are gone. In their place, the sunlight now hits a collection of glass jars filled with different types of aggregate and soil samples from my project sites. I stood in my living room on a Tuesday evening watching the golden hour light turn a jar of Worthington limestone into something that looked like crushed diamonds. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't waiting for a key to turn in the lock. I wasn't listening for the specific rhythm of a man's footsteps to gauge whether I should be small or supportive. The silence of my home had evolved from a hollow ache into a solid structural asset. I walked to the kitchen, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors I'd recently had refinished in a light natural oak. No more of the dark heavy cherry wood Connie had insisted suited a traditional Barton household. I pulled a single artisanal pasta bowl from the cabinet, a piece of pottery I'd bought at a local fair because I liked the weight of it, not because it matched a 12-person set. Paige knocked once and walked in carrying a stack of mail and a bottle of expensive sparkling water. She dropped the mail on the counter and leaned back watching me slice a single lemon with a precision that made her smile. "The foundation project is trending on LinkedIn again," she said, her voice bright. "2 more firms in Cincinnati want to sponsor our financial literacy workshops. And Gail called," she said. "The final audit of the wedding fund is done. The court is forcing Connie to pay back every cent of that $15,000 plus interest." I felt a small, steady throb of satisfaction in my chest, but it wasn't the jagged heat of revenge anymore. It was the feeling of a ledger finally being balanced. "I'm not putting that money back into savings, Paige. I'm using it to fund the first 6 months of the scholarship for women entering structural engineering." "That takes the cake," Paige laughed, popping the cap on the water. "Using Connie's debt to build more independent women. She'd have a fit if she knew." "She doesn't get to know," I said. "She's a closed file." I picked up the stack of mail. Most of it was professional invoices, site reports, invitations to speak at gala events. But at the bottom was a thick cream-colored envelope. I recognized the embossed crest on the back immediately. The Columbus Country Club. It was an invitation to the Barton family's annual autumn fundraiser. I didn't throw it away. I didn't feel the old panic rise in my throat. I set it on the counter and looked at it. For years, that invitation had been my performance review. It was where I had to wear the right dress, say the right things about Derek's brilliant future, and pretend I didn't notice Connie's friends looking at me like I was a temporary fixture. "You're not actually thinking of going, are you?" Paige asked, her eyebrows shooting up. "I'm going," I said. I felt a cold, calm clarity settle over me. "But not as a Barton. I'm going as a donor. The foundation project just received a $10,000 anonymous gift from Brenda Knox. She wants me to represent her interests there." I spent the next 3 days preparing, but not the way I used to. I didn't spend $400 on a blowout or obsess over whether my jewelry was too modern. I wore a tailored black suit that I used for board meetings, sharp shoulders, clean lines, and a pair of heels that sounded like a hammer hitting a nail. When I walked into the ballroom of the country club, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive cologne. It was the exact same smell as the wedding venue. For a split second, my pulse spiked a ghost of the old trauma, rattling the cage of my ribs. Then I saw Connie. She was standing near the bar, her smile brittle, her pearls reflecting the chandelier light. She looked older. The sharp predatory energy she used to carry had turned into something frantic. She was talking to a group of women who were nodding, but their eyes were darting around the room, looking for an exit. I didn't wait for her to see me. I walked straight toward her. "Connie," I said. My voice was level, carrying that professional weight that usually silenced a construction site. The group went silent. Connie turned, her face paling under her foundation. "Lay, I didn't think you'd have the nerve to show your face here after what you did to this family." "I didn't do anything to this family, Connie," I said. I leaned in just close enough to smell the gin on her breath. "I just turned the lights on. It's not my fault you didn't like what was crawling under the floorboards." I pulled a check from my pocket, the first installment of the court-ordered repayment she had sent to my lawyer. I handed it to her, but I didn't let go immediately. "This is going toward a scholarship for women who want to build things that actually stand," I whispered. "Thank you for the contribution." I walked away before she could respond. I didn't look back to see the expression on her face. I spent the rest of the evening talking to the architects and developers I had worked with for years. They treated me with a deference they had never shown when I was Derek's fiancée. I wasn't an accessory anymore. I was the architect. As I left the club, I saw a lone figure sitting on a bench near the fountain. It was Derek. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was in a rumpled suit, looking at his phone with a hollow, haunted expression. He looked up as I approached, and for a moment, the old lady wanted to sit down. She wanted to ask him if he'd eaten. She wanted to tell him it would be okay. I kept walking. The Oli was a house that had collapsed because the foundation wasn't mine. The woman walking toward the parking lot was a new build. I got into my car, the engine purring with a low, comforting vibration. I drove home to my blue door, to my limestone samples, and to a life where the only person I had to answer to was the woman looking back at me in the mirror. I had spent my life making sure buildings didn't fall. I finally realized that the most important structure I would ever maintain was the one I was standing in. My jaw didn't ache. My hands didn't shake. I was built to code. The heavy, humid air of the central Ohio summer hung low over the construction site, but inside the air-conditioned temporary trailer, the atmosphere was as sharp as a newly sharpened chisel. I was staring at a set of drainage plans for the new wing of the library when the door creaked open. It wasn't Mark or one of the foremen. It was Maya Derek's youngest cousin, a girl who had once sent me a secret thumbs-up emoji on the night I left the wedding. She looked exactly like I had 5 years ago. Her hair was pulled back a little too tightly, her eyes were darting toward the door as if expecting a ghost to appear, and her hands were twisting a thin silver ring around her finger until the skin turned pink. She sat down on the metal folding chair across from my desk, and the silence between us stretched out, fueled only by the distant rhythmic thud of a pile driver. Maya didn't start with a greeting. She started with a confession. Connie told my mother that if I don't sign the prenuptial agreement she drafted for us, I'm showing a lack of faith in the Barton name. She said that my career in graphic design is just a hobby I'll grow out of once the first baby comes. And Logan. Logan just sat there and nodded. I set my drafting pen down. The ink was black and permanent, just like the choices she was about to make. I didn't reach across the table to pat her hand. I didn't tell her it would be okay. Instead, I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the massive steel girders being hoisted into place. Maya, look at that crane, I said, pointing toward the yellow machine silhouetted against the gray sky. If the operator ignores the weight limit on that cable, the whole thing snaps. It doesn't matter how much he loves the building. It doesn't matter how much he wants to please the developer. Physics doesn't care about feelings. I turned back to her. You're looking for a reason to stay because you've been told that leaving is a failure. But I'm looking at your foundation, and it's already shifting. Logan nodding while his mother erases your career isn't a misunderstanding. It's an architectural flaw. It's a sheared bolt. Maya's lip trembled, but she didn't look away. Everyone says you were the one who broke the family, Lay. They say you were the one who couldn't handle the pressure. I leaned over the desk, my palms flat against the blueprints. I didn't break the family, Maya. I just stopped holding up the walls that were crushing me. I realized that if I was the only one providing the structural support, then it wasn't a family, it was a cage. You have a choice right now. You can sign that paper and spend the next 20 years apologizing for your own existence, or you can walk out that door and start building a site of your own. It will be quiet. It will be lonely for a while, but the roof will never fall on your head because someone else decided to pull a peeler. I reached into my drawer and pulled out a business card for the foundation project. I slid it across the table toward her. Connie Barton is a master of making you feel like you are a guest in your own life. But you own the deed to your mind, Maya. Don't let her sublet it for a price you can't afford to pay. Maya looked at the card, then up at me. For the first time, her hands stopped shaking. She picked up the card and tucked it into her pocket with a slow, deliberate movement. What do I do first? She whispered. You go home, I said, my voice as steady as a load-bearing beam. You pack your birth certificate, your passport, and your laptop. You change your bank passwords, and then you find a door that only opens with the key that you hold. As she walked out of the trailer, the sun finally broke through the clouds, hitting the library's glass facade and reflecting a blinding, brilliant light. I went back to my drainage plans. The math was clean. The site was secure. And for the first time in a long time, I knew that the legacy I was leaving behind wasn't a name, it was a set of tools. I checked my watch. It was 4 o'clock. Time to head home to Miller Avenue, to the blue door, and to the life I had built from the ground up, stone by beautiful stone. The heavy silence in your house tonight is not a void. It is a clean slate, a level grade upon which the first real bricks of your future can finally be laid. You stand in the center of the kitchen, the same kitchen where you once measured your worth by how well you served a man who wouldn't stand up for you, and you realize that the most expensive thing you ever owned was the lie that you needed someone else's permission to be whole. You spend years calculating the load distribution of skyscrapers, ensuring that thousands of tons of steel could withstand the wind, yet you allowed a woman with a silk scarf and a manipulative tongue to tell you that your own soul was structurally unsound. The lesson here is as cold and as certain as the laws of physics. You cannot build a life on a site you do not own. When you allow someone else to hold the title to your self-worth, they will always find a way to foreclose on your peace the moment you stop serving their interests. Integrity is not just about the strength of the materials, it is about the honesty of the design. A family that demands your diminishment as the price of admission is not a shelter. It is a demolition in slow motion. You learn that love is not a debt to be managed by a third party, and that loyalty to a partner who chooses silence over truth is actually a slow-acting poison for your own character. You look at the empty space where men used to stand, and you understand now that being useful is the trap they set for the strong. They wanted your competence to fund their lifestyle and your silence to protect their secrets, but they never wanted your fire. The world will often tell you that your independence is a flaw, that your boundaries are coldness, and that your demand for respect is arrogance. They say these things because a woman who knows her own worth is the only thing a manipulator cannot control. You are not a project to be managed, a support beam for someone else's ego, or a bank account for a matriarch's vanity. You are the architect of your own peace, and for the first time, your blueprints are clear. This is the structural reality of your life now. No one gets a key to your front door unless they respect the foundation you've built. Now, as you sit in the quiet strength of your reclaimed life, take a moment to look at the structures around you. We all have that one person who tries to tell us our foundation is cracking just so they can sell us the repair. We all know a Connie who uses the word family like a weapon, and a Derek who watches the theft happen because it's easier than standing up. Think about your own front door. Think about the keys you have handed out to people who haven't earned the right to enter your private sanctuary. Have you ever felt like a guest in your own life? Have you ever had to shrink your own voice just to keep the peace in a room that didn't even belong to you? If you were to look at the math of your current relationships today, the energy you give versus the respect you receive, would the numbers actually add up? Or are you subsidizing someone else's comfort with your own soul in the weeks and months that follow your own personal demolition? You will find that people like Connie Barton don't just disappear. They linger in the architecture of your habits. You will catch yourself reaching for the phone to check in, or you will find your heart racing when you see a navy blue SUV that looks like hers. But the difference now is that you have the inspection reports. You know that the fear she instilled in you was just papier-mâché painted to look like granite. When you stop fearing the collapse, the manipulator loses their only leverage. You realize that being alone in a sturdy house is infinitely better than being crowded in one that is actively falling down. You begin to notice the other women in your circle, the ones who look at their shoes when their mothers-in-law speak, the ones who apologize for being successful, the ones who have forgotten what their own unfiltered voice sounds like. You realize that by standing your ground, you haven't just saved yourself, you've provided a line of sight for others. You've become a landmark. Your story is the evidence that a woman can walk away from a $40 million wedding setup and still be the richest person in the room because she kept her soul. The final walkthrough of your old life is over. You have hauled away the debris of the Barton legacy, and you have cleared the site of the man who was too afraid to be a partner. As you look at the yellow legal pad on your desk filled with the new rules of your existence, you feel a sense of weightlessness that isn't empty, it's freedom. You are the lead engineer of your destiny, and the site is finally clear for you to build something that actually lasts. The concrete is pouring, the steel is rising, and this time the name on the deed is yours and yours alone. We want to hear your story because the only way to break the cycle of these invisible collapses is to speak the truth out loud. Have you ever had a moment where you realized the person you loved was just a puppet for someone else? How do you find the strength to change the locks, not just on your house, but on your heart? Share your experience with us because your blueprint for survival might be exactly what another woman needs to read before she signs a lease on a lie.